Tom Scoops Papa's Paper. Part C. I left the barn and ran all the way to the marshal's office. Uncle Mark was sitting in his swivel chair at his roll-top desk. I was disappointed not to see any prisoners in the 3 cells. I showed him my press card and asked him if there was any news about robberies or murders or cattle rustling. "I'm afraid not, J.D.," he said. Then he got me to tell him about Tom starting a newspaper in competition with Papa. I didn't think it was funny, but it made Uncle Mark laugh like all get out. But the next morning Uncle Mark sure wasn't laughing because the Aidenville bank was robbed of more than $10,000 during the night. These robbers didn't ride into town in the daytime and hold up the bank and ride out of town the way outlaws should. If they had, Uncle Mark could have formed a posse and tracked them down. Papa told us during lunch what a dirty trick these robbers had played on my uncle. Uncle Mark always kept close watch on the 2 saloons on the east side of the railroad track because that was where fights and trouble usually started. After the saloons closed, he went to bed because everybody else in town was in bed by then. It was while everybody was asleep that the robbers acted. They entered the home of Calvin Whitlock, the banker, at about 2 in the morning. They picked a good time because his sister was in Salt Lake City visiting relatives, and his housekeeper, Mrs. Hazelton, went to her own house at night. Mr. Whitlock was a widower who had never remarried and didn't have any children. Nobody in Aidenville locked their doors at night, so it was no trick for the robbers to enter the house. They sneaked into the banker's bedroom and woke Mr. Whitlock. They were wearing long yellow rain slickers, had their hats pulled way down on their heads so he couldn't see their hair, and were wearing masks made from red bandana handkerchiefs, with holes cut in them so they could see. One of them put a pistol to Mr. Whitlock's head and motioned for him to get out of bed and get dressed. Without speaking a word, they marched the banker to the Aidenville bank and made him open the door with his key. Using sign language, the robbers with the pistol gave Mr. Whitlock the choice of opening the safe or having his brains blown out. Mr. Whitlock decided his life was worth more than the money and opened the safe. The robbers tied him to a chair and put a gag in his mouth. Then they put the money from the safe into an old leather valise and left. Nobody knew what had happened until Mrs. Hazelton went to call Mr. Whitlock for breakfast and found the banker's bedroom empty. She telephoned Uncle Mark, who got Frank Callipy, who worked in the bank, to open the front door of the bank. They found Mr. Whitlock still tied to the chair. "If the robbery isn't solved," Papa said as he finished telling us about it at lunch, "the depositors at the bank will lose their money." I ran to the marshal's office after lunch and found Uncle Mark studying wanted posters. I showed him my press card in case he'd forgotten I was a genuine reporter. "What are you doing?" I asked. Uncle Mark looked plenty worried. "I thought I might get a lead from some of these wanted posters," he said, "but I can't find a single wanted man who ever pulled off a bank robbery like this one at night." There was one thing I really liked about Uncle Mark. He never talked down to Tom and me, but treated us just like grown-ups. "Maybe they left town right after the robbery," I said, trying to be helpful. "I wish they had," Uncle Mark said. "That would give me a lead. Horses make tracks, and if they had left town they would have headed for the Nevada line, taking the shortcut over the Frisco Mountains. But I rode out and checked this morning. There are no fresh tracks turning off the road towards the Nevada line, and I checked out all the drifters and strangers who were in town yesterday. They are all still here." "If nobody can identify them, how can you catch them?" I asked. "Stolen money always burns a hole in a robber's pocket," Uncle Mark said. "I don't want Tom printing this in his newspaper, but I'll just wait until one of them starts spending a lot of money in the saloons, drinking and gambling." "What if they don't?" I asked, trying to be helpful. "Then I'll just keep an eye on any strangers or drifters who leave town suddenly and get a posse and track them down," Uncle Mark answered. When I returned home, I found Tom at his desk in the barn. I told him what Uncle Mark had said. "Uncle Mark is a good peace officer," Tom said, "but he isn't using his head. These robbers are too slick to start spending a lot of money in town, and too smart to leave town until things cool off so no suspicion will be attached to them. And I don't believe the robbery was pulled by any drifter or strangers in town." "Why not?" I asked. Because the robbers took too much care in making sure they couldn't be identified, Tom said. They didn't even speak, which means one of them, or maybe both, were afraid Mr. Wicklow would recognize their voice. Well, they sure aren't Mormons, I said, because Mormons don't go around robbing banks, and they sure don't live on this side of town, because everybody living west of the tracks are law-abiding citizen. Good thinking, J.D., Tom said. That leaves just somebody living in the Sheepman's Hotel or the rooming house on the other side of the railroad tracks, which means they must eat their meals in the Palace Cafe or in the Sheepman's Hotel restaurant, and that gives me an idea. Go get Basil. I no got no news yet, Basil said when we entered the barn. I sit in corner of cafe and listen to customers for supper last night until 8 o'clock, but no news. I think the men who robbed the bank must eat some of their meals in your father's cafe, Tom said. As one of my reporters, it will be your job to listen to the customers without letting them know you are listening. How I do that? Basil asked. You can hide behind the counter in the dining room where your father keeps his pies and cakes and things, Tom said. You can listen to what the customers say without them knowing it. Maybe Papa don't let me, Basil said. Show him your press card and tell him you work for me, Tom said. Tell him it is part of being a 100% American boy.